Alex, tip number 5, please.
Last one. So to return to the translating the curriculum, that last tip was about talk, academic talk, and trying to elaborate and build upon our ideas. We looked at vocabulary, knowing that vocabulary, potentially using that, and we tried to activate prior knowledge with those mind maps and with the collage collections. My final piece is a tip around writing, and it's sentence expanding. And we might think, okay, well, if we look at the expanse of the curriculum, in some subjects like mathematics, we might need to write more than a sentence. It might be a definition of area, and that's fine and appropriate. In some subjects, like history, well, a sentence feels pretty inadequate for the actual demands of translating the curriculum. In modern languages, a sentence is probably the unit of learning that we're often working with, but we do want to get beyond that. But sentence expanding, why I think that's important, is it's about explicit, high-quality teaching of how pupils need to translate this language of our curriculum domains into writing, and sentence is the unit of sense that pupils can grapple with, that novices can take on. And to be honest, I keep on talking about infinite variation and intelligent adaptation. Sentence expanding is that kind of writing with the training wheels on, but very quickly you can motor and you can do all sorts of developments and teaching with it. And if I think about what is the underpinning, again, knowledge, understanding, kind of evidence sources for that. So we know a lot that explicit teaching of writing both improves writing, but also it can improve thinking and your understanding. So when we write about what we read, we often have a better memory, and we also kind of elaborate upon it, and we build that knowledge schema, whatever terms we want to use. So explicit writing instruction helps crystallize our knowledge and understanding, and helps begin to use that often as well, particularly in those subjects where writing essays and exam questions is the modus operandi, kind of our aims. There's also, with sentence expanding, there's a bit of elaboration in there as well. We're trying to stretch their ideas, we're trying to build their knowledge, and I want to give examples of that. So we're using the unit of a sentence to build their knowledge and to elaborate and to get them thinking of ideas and connections, but in a very structured, focused way that every novice can handle. And then there's that aspect of reasoning as well. So, if often, and not always, but can you cogently express this in the written word? It's not always necessary. If you're doing problem solving, then writing up how you solve the problem might feel a bit extraneous and just not necessary. But in a lot of cases across the school curriculum, being able to write a sentence summarizing something, being able to write a short paragraph, or writing an extended essay is the end game. And that reasoning in written words is pretty typical of the skill we want all of our pupils to have far beyond the school gates in whatever kind of worldly context. So let me give some examples about what I mean specifically by sentence expanding. So the evidence on writing instruction, there's quite a lot of it, perhaps less so than reading, but there's quite a lot of good evidence to show that starting with sentences is really valuable, particularly for novice developing writers. But a developing writer can be 5 years old or 15 years old, and often we make too many assumptions of the teenager. So we have something called sentence combining, which is you take simple sentences and you add them together into one complex sentence. That's about grammar. That's about writing how you might think developing in English. But sentence expanding is about taking the kernel of a sentence. It might be the initial clause, and we'll give some examples, but then adding to it. It's expanding the sentence. And that, on one aspect, can be a stylistic thing, an English thing, getting better at writing and writing accurate sentences. But often in our school curriculum, it's about knowledge building. So in history, if we're writing about a significant figure, William Wilberforce, actually expanding the sentence is about using evidence to better characterize William Wilberforce. So you might have a sentence, Wilberforce, because in our history writing, we'll have these little strategies of we'll just go straight to the surname. Wilberforce famously helped end slavery. ... Now, that first kernel of the sentence, that very simple sentence, William Wilberforce helped end slavery, within itself there's a lot of knowledge packed in there, there's a lot of insight, and it's a historical claim that we want to talk about, write about, and have historical sources on. But of course, if a pupil was to write in an exam response or an essay response, that simple sentence, he ended slavery, well, actually, we would recognise that's a very limited representation of historical knowledge. So we want them to expand on that. And how I often do it, and I model this in when I'm doing some writing work with different teachers, is, okay, now I want to take that kernel and we're just going to pop a comma at the end of it. It's no longer a full stop. William Wilberforce famously helped end slavery, comma, with, and then we give that little connection, and then what's the evidence, what's one piece of evidence that showed he contributed to the end of slavery? And it might be about his formulation of a certain group. It might be his signing of a proclamation. And how you can expand that sentence, sometimes infinitely, but typically with one addition or two additions. You do the William Wilberforce ended slavery kernel, comma, and then I want one piece of evidence. You have to model this, you have to scaffold it like most steps in a problem, like most pieces of high quality writing. But what's that one first piece of evidence? So they give you an extra clause giving that historical fact. So, about him initiating a group, that was very significant. Then, okay, we talk about that, we might look at that, I might model it with them and kind of glean a really good example. And then, okay, we're going to translate this full stop into another comma. And I might need to give them the little connective word, but what we're doing is we're expanding it again. This time, I want two pieces of evidence. You've given me your first one. He ended slavery because he set up this proclamation society. And then secondly, what's another piece of evidence we know for how he contributed to the end of slavery? Suddenly, we get to the end of that task, highly scaffolded, well structured. We've effectively got a detailed sentence, nigh on a paragraph for most of our pupils, often scaffolded beyond the point they naturally go to themselves independently. And we've got a sentence that is elaborate, that's extended, and that feels like historians, tackle that piece of response. And if I quickly give some other examples, so in design technology, in secondary school, or you're making in primary school. So my little boy was making a boat, and it was related to Scott of the Antarctic, etc. And you can very easily, making a product or making a cushion in year 7 or all those variations, you can very, very much just focus on the doing. But actually what we need in those creative design, kind of projects is some evaluation, some reflection on what I did and why I did it. So, I designed a robust base. We might give them a point. Okay, what did you do with developing this boat to make it successful? And then with Noah, okay, one of the things, he created this base. So I designed a robust base. Then, to help Noah and the rest of the class expand on that sentence, we're going to use that "so that" clause. So I built this robust base so that, and then he has to elaborate and explain on it. And then you use 2 or 3 "so that" sentences. Suddenly, you've got a pupil with a really lovely paragraph reflecting, evaluating upon their product design, the thing that they've done. And you can see how this can translate to art. You can see how this can translate to creative subjects, but also some reflection potentially in terms of different problems and projects and tasks and case studies across the curriculum. But fundamentally, it's about that scaffolding. And another variation is sometimes, let's go back to the example for area and perimeter. Sometimes we know that pupils confuse some terms, and actually we want to commit that in their books to writing. So we might have a sentence starter: area is different to perimeter in that ... And again, we're just, every time it's about expanding the sentence, getting them to elaborate, think a bit harder about why these things are happening. And by writing it down, yes, you might have a bit of challenge about their writing skills and spelling and all those other things, but invariably, pupils need to be able to translate that thinking into the written format. Now, there are boundaries to that, and we shouldn't extend it to every corner of every subject domain, but invariably, writing at a sentence level is something we want to craft, we want to perfect, and the more pupils can do that, then actually, you take William Wilberforce, if you can write that brilliant historical sentence, that claim with evidence, then what is an essay except except a kind of an elaboration of that, a connection of those claims with evidence, with counterclaims, with sources, etc. So that sentence is the kernel and the point that you build upon. And sometimes you just need the sentence, but sometimes that sentence expansion is the start of a more extended process of extended writing.
Oh, I love this, Alex. Right, okay. So I've one question, and then I've got something I've been looking forward to asking somebody for about 2 years. So you're my man for this. All right. So I'll give you the question first, then we're going to go for this.
Bit nervous about the last one, but go on.
So you mentioned kind of so that and in that as kind of good kind of connectors to help expand the sentence. I'd imagine things like because and but would be. Are there any other kind of good ones that tend to be used quite well?
So because and but. So people might be familiar with the Writing Revolution, which is an American originated book, but very popular. I think like a lot of history teachers have used it, etc. So because but so is perhaps their famous kind of sentence structure, and because but so you can see how that's getting to elaborate. I think that's super useful, really helpful, and particularly for younger children, a really good framework and scaffold. I think when you get to older students, because and but and so, that's quite a simplistic notion of history, isn't it? If you think, oh, this happens because this. So that's almost a scaffold that for most students is a great starting point, but then you need to make some claims and make connections that are a bit richer. But how do you get a novice there without those kind of training structures? So for me, because but are really helpful. Ultimately, what we're talking about is they use different terms, but discourse markers, are pretty much the kind of the term that's I think is most accurate and useful. Discourse meaning language, markers meaning those little markers that signal kind of the glue of the sentence, the turning points, the key information that's going to come. So things like but, however, they are, if you're making argument writing, however, but, whereas, that's when we can structure counterclaims and contrasts. But often, say in English, we're looking for more than one point. So we might have firstly, secondly, furthermore, moreover. So there are these patterns. And I think there's a book, I think it might be I Say, We Say. But in the US, they've created entire books which offer these scaffolds and sentence structures. And I think, again, I think there's an intelligent adaptation there. There's somewhere in the middle where we want to use those structures as training wheels, some phrases. For me, so that is just so versatile. But then we also need to remember that the sentence is a unit of sense for definitions, for remembering key knowledge, but it doesn't, we need to go further than that. And at the point where we're ready to go further, once we've perfected centered expansion, then we might need to drop some of the more artificial kind of discourse markers and get a bit more sophisticated. So I think, there's a whole variation of those out there, and it doesn't take long to find them. I think the key thing there is not, you can have a knowledge organizer with every discourse marker under the sun. I've got a PowerPoint slide with lots of them. It's about using the right ones for the right purpose and remembering when you use that scaffold for the sentences and the expansion to take it away. Otherwise, you have pupils using this endless parroting formula, which, again, over time stops being the kind of the appropriate academic complexity that's needed in the school curriculum.
Perfect. All right, Alex, here's the question I wanted to ask you, right? So what you tend to see a lot in maths classrooms, and I've done this for many years, is let's say I ask you, what's the area of a triangle? And you just say back to me, base multiplied by height divided by 2. And I say, brilliant. Or I say to you, what's Pythagoras' theorem? And you say, c squared equals a squared plus b squared. I say, fantastic.
Yeah.
What I've started to do now is insist the kids say the full sentence back. So I'd say, what's the area of a triangle?
Yeah.
And I'd want you to say back, the area of a triangle is base times height divided by 2. Pythagoras' theorem is c squared equals a squared plus b squared. Now, I have 2 bits of logic for this. One I'm quite happy with. The second is dubious. So I need you to come in on the dubious one, right? So the obvious, the thing I'm fairly happy with is if another child in the class hasn't been listening, and they just tune into your answer and you say c squared equals a squared plus b squared, they've no idea what you're talking about. Whereas if they hear you say Pythagoras' theorem is c squared equals a, they've got that connect. So I'm quite happy with that. That feels like a sensible reason. But the other thing, and I've been claiming this, Alex, so I'm hoping it's true, is whenever kids sit GCSE papers in maths and they're asked to do like a discuss question or describe or explain, kids are really bad at it, and the marks are terrible because students struggle writing, communicating in mathematically in written form because they're not used to it. So my logic has been, the more I get kids to respond verbally in sentences, that'll ease the transition to writing in sentences. But I have zero evidence to back that up. Would you be happy with that? It's not the definite yes I was looking for, but I'll take.
No. So take the first point. I think that point you made about that kind of full recognition of that utterance, and it's important. It's important enough to write a sentence about it, so it's important enough to repeat it with accuracy. So I really like that, and the Pythagoras example really helpful because pupils do tune into fragments, don't they? Kind of tune out of lessons. I wrote recently about mind wandering. Minds wander for 30-40% of a lesson, entirely natural. So tuning in to those full utterances, I think, is super helpful. I think the second point, I think there's a partial helpful near truth, but I think what I would say is, I don't think there's any evidence that if you can say it, you can write it. But I'd say it's a necessary condition, but insufficient to lead to the complete writing that we're after. So I think broadly, I don't think I couldn't cite to you strong evidence to say that is a thing that's pretty much kind of solid and replicable. But I would say what you're claiming there feels to me entirely common sense and low effort, and actually there's no bad things that can come from that. But it might give me the illusion that it will translate easily to their writing. And the reality is, the act of writing a sentence is really complex. It's kind of this miniature challenge which includes handwriting, so motor skills, it includes spelling, it includes word choice, it includes grammar. So by writing it, your working memory is just overloaded that little bit more than saying it. So I think I think what you're doing is a good strategy. I encourage it. I wouldn't be confident about the evidence claiming that it works, but I think it's broadly very sensible. And I think it's a necessary, beneficial thing to do, but it'd be insufficient to lead to the quality writing that you want. Because that quality writing, just like the sentence expansion, requires lots of explicit instruction. And ultimately, all of the tips I've shared here are about being super explicit about the vocabulary and the conceptual understanding of those words, about being really explicit about what pupils know and what we're about to teach them and what we activate, being really explicit about a singular sentence. So I think what you're doing is right for me, that you're being really deliberate about the language we're using in talk, and we're having a high standard of academic talk, and we want to see that replication in writing. I think the higher standard of our talk, good things happen, but we need to go that extra mile, that last mile often, to explicitly teach how to write a good definition in maths as well.
Yeah, that makes perfect. Yeah, I'll take that, Alex, because it certainly feels like it might not be the case that if they can say it, they can write it, but it certainly feels if they can't say it, they're really going to struggle with the writing. Okay. I'll deal you on that. That's good.
Yeah, and if they can't say it in a clear, cogent way, that could be an indication they just, in maths, they might conceptually have the number bonds to do it, but they can't quite explain it. So, there's nuances to that, but broadly, I think that's why just a minute, I think, so valuable, where you want them to be able to say it, and then they can normally explain it, reason it, and do it. And it's one of those kind of inadequate proxies we've got. If they can say it, we think they can write it. If they can write it and say it, we think they can do it. But we've got to make sure there's not the knowing doing gap, and we've got to help them do it as well.
Brilliant. Perfect. Well